Hello, everyone, and welcome to Module 3, where we will be exploring human cultural variation. Let's start with the biggest misconception that students often bring into this particular class, that race is about biology, that it's natural, or that it's rooted in DNA. As anthropologists, we know this is wrong. And we know it not just because we believe it, but because we've proven it scientifically and ethnographically for over a century. Let me break it down. In the early 20th century, anthropologists like Franz Boas and Ashley Montagu began to dismantle the pseudoscientific racial hierarchies that had underpinned everything from slavery to eugenics. What they did is they used cranial measurements. And in doing this, Boas in particular, he demonstrated that biological traits that were once thought to be racial, like head shape, were actually influenced by environment and nutrition. This work was really fundamental. It laid the groundwork for what we now call the social construction of race. Here's how your textbook, your second textbook, Perspectives, puts it. It says there's more genetic variation within so-called racial groups than between them. It's interesting because that means that the idea that you can divide humanity into black, white, Asian, indigenous, etc., based on biology is actually scientifically false. Take skin color, for example. It's actually a function of melanin, latitude, and evolutionary adaptation, like your textbook says. It's not a function of intelligence or morality or ability. But if race isn't real biologically, why does it still feel so real socially? Who benefits from keeping race visible? Well, anthropologists like Jonathan Marks have argued that race persists because it's useful, not scientifically, but politically. It helps institutions sort people. It creates hierarchies. It organizes labor. It can even be used to justify inequality. In Perspectives, Chapter 9 makes the case very clearly. Race is a social and political construct, not a biological reality. Here's what that means. Yes, humans vary biologically, skin color, hair texture, facial features, etc. But those variations don't map neatly or consistently onto racial categories. In fact, there's far more genetic variation within racial groups than between them. And this is backed by decades of genetic research. Two black people may have more genetic difference between them than one of them has with a white person. So why do we keep organizing people by race? Well, it's because race is not about what's in your genes. It's about how societies create categories of difference. Let's break it down a little further. Point 1, race isn't real in biology, but it's very real in its effects. As the saying goes, race is socially constructed, but it kills. Think of racial disparities in healthcare, in policing, housing, education, even outcomes from COVID-19. None of those disparities are accidents. They were baked into the system. Race was invented to serve specific historical purposes, in particular, colonialism and slavery. As anthropologist Audrey Smedley explains, the idea of race, it emerged in the 17th century alongside transatlantic slavery. Europeans really needed, in that moment, a moral and scientific justification to enslave Africans. So they invented race to do the ideological work. They naturalized hierarchy by claiming that Africans were biologically inferior, fit for labor, and non-human or less than human. But that's not science, that's political technology. Race today continues to function as a system of power. It organizes who gets access to resources, safety, representation, and credibility. and it's coded into everything from zip code zoning to prison sentencing algorithms. Let me give you another example, one of race in medicine. So even today, doctors can prescribe different treatments based on the perceived race of a patient. There are still medical textbooks as well that suggest that Black people feel less pain. That's not biology. That's a legacy of racism reinforced through pseudoscientific narratives. And the consequences are deadly. Black women in the United States are 3 to 4 times more likely to die from childbirth complications than white women across class levels. So here's the key takeaway. Race is real, but not in the way you think. It's not in your DNA, it's in our laws, our institutions, our media, and our assumptions. It is fundamentally a cultural system that produces difference, sometimes in ways that justify inequality. And this is why anthropology insists that we study race not as a fact of nature, but as a fact of culture and power. Now contrast that with ethnicity, which is based in culture, but still not a fixed essence. In the Perspectives textbook, ethnicity is defined as a shared sense of identity among a group of people based on common ancestry, language, history, or culture. So ethnicity is about shared culture, but it's also about exclusion, power, and recognition. In cultural anthropology, ethnicity is defined not simply as a label for people who share language, religion, or ancestry. It's also a way of drawing boundaries between us on the one hand and them on the other. Chapter 9 is very clear about this. Ethnic identity is always contextual, and it's always relational. Unlike race, which is often imposed from the outside based on supposed biology, ethnicity can be self-ascribed. It can also be socially negotiated, and it can be strategically mobilized depending on time and place. Ethnicity often includes things like shared language or a common historical memory, shared religious or spiritual practices, also symbolic markers like dress, food, or music, and connection to a homeland, regardless of whether that homeland is real or imagined. But, and this is key, ethnicity is not static. As Perspectives explains, it's dynamic. It's shaped by history, politics, and the needs of the moment. The foundational anthropologist Fredrik Barth flipped the script on how we understand ethnicity. Instead of focusing on the, quote, cultural content of an ethnic group, like what they wear, what they eat, what they believe, Barth argued that the boundaries between groups are what matter most. He writes, "It is the ethnic boundary that defines the group, not the cultural stuff it encloses." So, in other words, it's not what's inside the group that matters most, it's how the group defines itself against others. For example, the line between Palestinian and Israeli isn't just cultural or religious. It's political, it's historical, and it's maintained through institutions like state borders, military power, and media narratives. Similarly, the line between Latino and white in the US isn't fixed. It's instead shaped by immigration law, racial politics, and economic conditions. Let's bring this down a little bit more into real life. So ethnicity isn't just a census category. It shows up in a bunch of different places. Take diaspora communities, for example, where some people might identify as both Nigerian and Black in the US, but identify as Igbo or Yoruba within their own family. or immigration systems, where the US might classify all Arabic speaking people as white, even though they are racialized differently in everyday life. Or think about student clubs, where belonging often hinges not just on ethnic heritage, but on speech, on clothing, behavior, and cultural fluency. Ethnicity also shows up in internet subcultures, like on TikTok, where you'll see creators showcasing ethnic aesthetics like Punjabi dance or Palestinian dabke or black hair care, only to see those practices then copied and monetized by people outside the community. So while ethnicity may appear to be sort of about culture, it's also about power, gatekeeping, and access. Like race, ethnicity is socially constructed, but that doesn't mean that it's arbitrary or somehow imaginary. It's shaped by a few different forces, and I want to go through some of these individually. The first is colonialism. Colonialism froze fluid identities into rigid categories through the creation of borders and the erasure of certain cultural identities. Then there's nationalism. Nationalism often tries to suppress ethnic diversity in favor of a unified citizenry. Diaspora also plays a role in shaping ethnicity. The movement of people from one place to another has meant that people have maintained ties across generations and borders. Then violence and trauma, as seen in things like ethnic cleansing, cultural erasure, or forced assimilation. Ethnic identity can be a source of pride and connection, but it can also be a target for discrimination, depending on context. Finally, it's important to note that people often move between ethnic labels strategically. For example, a second-generation student might identify as Asian American in school, but might identify as just Korean at home. Or a politician may emphasize indigenous identity to gain trust in one setting, but then downplay it in another. There are good examples online that you can look up on your own of Obama speaking in different contexts and using African American Vernacular English, or AAVE, in one speech in front of a Black audience, but then adjusting his speech, adjusting the way he talks in other speeches to white audiences. Or think about on campus. Someone might join an ethnic affinity group as a way of finding community, even if they weren't raised in the culture. So the final takeaway here is that ethnicity is not a thing you have. It's a thing you do, a boundary that you navigate, or a story that you inherit and reshape. It's cultural, yes, but it's also strategic, political, and deeply felt. The cases and examples that I've thrown out at you so far in this lecture show us what anthropologists like Barth and others emphasize. Identity is not something fixed. It's something we negotiate, defend, and sometimes struggle to claim. Boundaries are maintained through institutions, language, and community judgment, not just personal feelings. And those boundaries have real stakes. They affect who's listened to, who's believed, and who's rendered visible. So whether we're talking about Black versus biracial, brown versus Latino, or something else, what we're really talking about is how culture shapes recognition, and about how power and community shape identity. And we're talking about how anthropology helps us see that those blurry, contested boundaries are not a problem to fix, but a reality to understand. Race, ethnicity, identity, they are all socially constructed, but that does not mean that they're not real. It means they're made, they're maintained, they're negotiated, And that's what makes them really powerful. This is where sometimes students and people outside of anthropology get a little confused. They hear, quote, socially constructed, and they think that that means imaginary, trivial, or entirely subjective. But social construction doesn't mean something is fake. It means that its meaning and its impact come from culture, not nature. Let's break it down. A social construct is a concept that we, as a society, collectively agree to treat as real, even if it has no objective or biological foundation. You can think of money as an example, or national borders, or even time zones. None of these things are rooted in biology, but all of them shape your life, your schedule, your rights, your survival. Race is not real like blood types are real, but it is very real like money, citizenship, or gender are real. That is socially real, institutionally real, and politically real. But if race isn't biological, why do we see racial disparities in healthcare, policing, housing, and incarceration? Well, it's because race works like an algorithm. It gets coded into systems through things like census data, or redlining, or medical charts. It gets policed socially. Who's, quote, black enough? Who's white passing? It gets taught through media, like TV tropes, memes, movies, social media. And as perspectives and thinkers like Audrey Smedley emphasize, the categories of race were invented for specific political purposes, especially to justify slavery and colonialism. But even though their origin was political, their consequences are deeply, deeply personal. Anthropologist Audrey Smedley argued that the modern concept of race emerged in Europe and colonial America not as a neutral description of difference, but as a tool for labor control. It provided, essentially, the ideological glue that allowed chattel slavery to coexist with Enlightenment humanism. And Stuart Hall, a cultural theorist, said that race and ethnicity are part of, quote, regimes of representation. That means they're not just categories. They're systems of meaning used to organize who counts, who belongs, and who is dangerous. So when we say race is a social construct, we're not dismissing it. We're exposing it. We're identifying it as a human-made technology of power, rather than a fact of nature. So yes, in conclusion, race is socially constructed. Ethnicity is socially constructed, but neither of them are arbitrary. They are constructed through struggle, through institutions, and through power. And if they're constructed, then that means they can be deconstructed. They can be challenged. They can be remade in more equitable ways. That, in a nutshell, is why anthropology matters. And it's why this particular class session matters as well. So in the next week, please remember to take your reading quiz, do any assignments that are listed on web courses, and think about how this lecture connects to what you read in your Perspectives textbook. Thanks, everyone. Have a great week.